In 2019, my co-host Dennis Prager was on The Bill Maher Show when he said that it is a lie that men can menstruate. This statement led to a fury of laughter among the audience, including Bill Maher, who chuckled and said to Dennis, "I somehow missed this whole story." Less than 4 years later, to deny that men can menstruate means that you are a transphobe. I know that many of us look at examples like these, among many others, and wonder, where did this wokeism come from? How did it ascend so rapidly? Today, I'm pleased to welcome someone who has written a book on that very subject, The Origins of Woke. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. It is great, as always, to be with you. Every episode of Timeless is exciting, but I am especially excited whenever we have an in-studio guest, as we have today. Richard Hanania is here. He is the president and founder of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology and a research fellow at the University of Texas. He was previously a research fellow at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. He's also the author of Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. He's also been called a white supremacist by The Atlantic and a fringe ideologue who has, quote, a home among extremists by New York Magazine. I just thought I would add that in your bio.
No, it's a point of pride.
Well, I want to ask you some questions about that, but welcome, Richard. Welcome to the show. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Julie. Glad to be here.
So can you give me a little bit of a background? That was your formal bio, but give me a background on how you got interested in this subject and why is it that all of these publications have called you these names?
Yeah, so I'm, been most of my adult life, I've been an academic. I went to law school. I went to UCLA. I studied political science. And I just sort of was horrified by what I saw within universities. Just what I saw in there and what I was reading was going on outside of universities and in the broader culture. And this book is basically, my understanding of where wokeness came from. Like, people, I think, have always seen it as sort of a cultural phenomenon, but people don't really realize, like, in the last 50, 60 years, a lot of this stuff came out of law, and it was actually part of law before it became part of culture. And, you can understand why a lot of the leftist media will not like that. They really, really didn't like the book. They thought I was having too much influence. They didn't like the ideas in there. They didn't want this book to be published. But I think it's important because it's not only giving you the historical story of how we got here, it's a roadmap. It's like literally next Republican president, this is what you've got to do. Conservative law clerks, judges, this is where the state has basically, this is where we've gone wrong. This is how race and gender-based government became part of the American system, and this is how you undo it. So I think that this book is like really dangerous for what the identity-obsessed left wants to do.
I can see in your table of contents that you deal with a lot of varied subjects pertaining to wokeism. Can you give us a roadmap of the roadmap in your book, the various subjects that you talk about?
Yeah, so I'm trying, I'm approaching this like a social scientist, which is my background. I'm trying to tell you, like, look, these things that you think wokeness is that just maybe you heard about in the last 5-10 years, like the idea that if there's tests and one group does better than the other, that's a sign of discrimination, or the idea that schools are racist if they discipline one group more than the other. This stuff that sounds crazy, or no differences between men and women. The free speech restrictions. You go back and you find that basically the law forced this on institutions. So colleges, for example, didn't adopt racial and gender quotas until the federal government forced them to do so in the 1970s. Corporate HR comes from civil rights law. Basically, the threat of lawsuits. I got a chart in the book that shows the number of HR employees going like this, basically since the 1960s. They did this, for a reason, to protect themselves. There was, pure power politics involved. I tell you how we got there. I explain like the legal background. I explain like why I think that this is so important. Why the law is actually driving everything. Why Republicans have done so little about this over over the last 40 years. Why now is a good time to do it, because the factors that prevented them before are there now. And also exactly what it is you can do. So that's the history. If you like history, if you like, the law sounds sort of boring, but it's exciting in this case, because
law
it's
is very
really
interesting.
Even if you're not normally interested in law on this topic in particular, even the way we classify race, I have an entire chapter on this. It's sort of accidental, these categories like Hispanic and Asian American, Pacific Islander. It's a fascinating history. I think people will learn a lot.
I want to talk to you about that, how we classify race in law, because I remember taking a constitutional law course in college, and I learned about strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny. In other words, these levels of scrutiny that we apply to a statute or an interpretation of a statute based on what immutable characteristic you have, your race, your gender, et cetera. So we're going to get to that. I thought I would tease it, also put a pin in it so that I don't forget. But before we get there, on this show, Timeless, I talk a lot about philosophers and various thinkers of the past few centuries, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Friedrich Nietzsche. And the reason why I've become so fascinated with these thinkers who were in the 18th and 19th centuries, respectively, is that I see the origins of woke in a lot of their philosophies. For instance, it was Rousseau who said that men are born perfect in a state of nature, and then it is society that corrupts them. That is a characteristically left-wing, poverty causes you to commit crime, not your own poorly calibrated internal compass. That is a characteristically left-wing argument. So it seems like some of the seeds of the woke tree that has grown were planted long before we might think they were. Do you agree with that? If you could pinpoint the moment that woke started, what would you say it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the way I define woke and the way I see it, it's more of sort of an institutional, it's a sort of a system, right? And nobody sort of, one of the arguments of the book is nobody planned this system. It was sort of cobbled together based on civil rights law, some of it well-meaning, some of it not so well-meaning, but bureaucrats following their interests, corporate America following its interests, universities being ideologically captured. Like people have ideas, philosophers, have been saying things forever. I think what civil rights law did was that basically it institutionalized certain identities and then created the opening for people with bad ideas to take power within institutions, right? So the ideas are important. I'm glad there's people out there like my friend Chris Rufo, who wrote a recent book on ideas and, the philosophy behind wokeness. But they don't get anywhere without the judges and the bureaucrats basically, solidifying what they believe and providing them an opportunity through civil rights law. You wouldn't have to worry about, the crazy ideas about the men and women, being exactly the same. If like that literally wasn't required, something you were required to believe as a business, right? And I explain like how this is actually government requirements. So yeah, I appreciate the philosophical perspective. I think you're right on Rousseau. Nietzsche's father of modern left is a little bit of a harder sell for me. But yeah, I focus on sort of, I think it's whatever thinkers you want to blame, civil rights law created that opening for them.
If you want to be sold on how Nietzsche is one of the intellectual godfathers of the modern left, watch my Thinker of the Month series with Spencer Clavin.
Okay, I'll check it out.
We'll circle back and see if Richard is convinced. So you've now referenced civil rights law a few times. What do you mean by that? Do you mean the 60s passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, or preceding that?
So there was, so it starts with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It does something that, we all remember and recall fondly, which is it banned Jim Crow discrimination. It banned intentional discrimination. And that's basically what the senators and the congressmen at the time thought they were doing, right? And so civil rights law is the Civil Rights Act, but how it's interpreted over time. And so within 7 years of the Civil Rights Act, which says don't discriminate based on race, you have the Griggs decision, the Supreme Court, saying that disparate impact, if you give a test, even if you don't intend to discriminate, or whites do better than blacks, that's potentially a violation of the Civil Rights Act.
Why?
Because it's discriminatory. It's the impact. It's not the.
How is an impact discriminatory?
It's
how is an outcome discriminatory? If you give people the same test and one race does better at that test overall or generally, than others. How is that test discriminatory then?
You have to ask the Burger Court. I mean, their reasoning, you could go back and look at the case. It's not that long. It's not an impressive reasoning. I mean, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, didn't want the plaintiffs to appeal the case because they thought they would lose. They thought the history was so clear in the Civil Rights Act. But the Warren Court and the Burger Court had gone crazy on all kinds of issues in the 1960s and 70s.
So forgive me for interrupting. I just want to clarify, because you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that although philosophers have had their impact on wokeism, this has really been codified and established through law.
Yeah.
But take something like that decision that you referenced 7 years after the 64 Civil Rights Act with the disparate impact. How is that not the outgrowth of ideas? In other words, how is that rooted in law?
Yeah, Julie, that's a very smart question. So yeah, they are, you could look back at sort of what liberals were thinking at the time, and were they reading Rousseau? It doesn't seem like they were sort of motivated by sort of this high-end philosophy is my reading of the history. So a lot of them just, sort of felt bad. They wanted, some of this is sort of sympathetic. They looked at the plight of Black Americans. They were impatient. They saw that they banned discrimination, explicit discrimination, but it's not like the next day all the doctors and the lawyers became Blacks, or they were doing well in tests and getting into the best schools. And so there was this sort of desperation that we're going to speed history up. And a lot of it was just it was pro-America, pro-capitalist. LBJ is browbeating the heads of corporate America and telling them, you guys got to hire more blacks. You got to hire more blacks. Think LBJ, he's coming. It's only a few years after, segregation. He grew up in the segregated South. So they're not thinking of reverse discrimination. Nobody is taking that seriously at the time. And so that's sort of the context where this stuff comes in. Now, unfortunately, it never went away, right? It sort of radicalized over time. It became, a hostile work environment. Oh, you make Black people uncomfortable. Oh, having a criminal background check is racist, right? You have the, sort of the race hustlers, the Sharptons and the Jesse Jacksons of the world. They're dealing with, there's still their white guilt over the racial past. And so, a lot of this is sort of more banal than this high-end philosopher. Yeah, some of these, sort of radicals are there, but a lot of it is misguided liberals plus corruption of institutions plus race hustling and
Totally.
White guilt all mixed together and creating this stuff.
Oh yeah, I'm not convinced that the sex, drugs, and rock and roll hippies of the 50s and 60s were picking up the first and second discourses by Rousseau.
Yeah.
I do think they were reading Marx, but I hear what you're saying, that they're not, well versed in these philosophers' thought. But I think an idea like that, they may not know that it's attributed to Rousseau, but Rousseau kind of planted the seed, and it evolved and got passed around like a sick, woke hot potato.
Yeah.
That culminated at the end of the 20th century. So, okay, so you talk about disparate impact. Can you just, in a sentence or two, synopsize what that court decision said about disparate impact?
It says that if there's any measure for employment, hiring, or promotion where one group does better than the other, there's a presumption that it's discriminatory. And then the burden shifts to the business to prove that it's not.
Yes. Well, that's what we're seeing now. The MCAT has taken out a quarter of its questions and swapped them with questions about social issues in psychology. Step 1 of the U.S. medical licensing exam is now pass-fail because of this disparate impact among racial groups. Also, that Step 1 exam, they swapped out science questions for non-science questions about interpersonal relationships. Mm-hmm. So it just shows you, and you know this better than anyone, how much this has infiltrated into our institutions.
Yeah, I didn't even know about the MCAT. Yeah,
it's crazy.
I saw the SAT. The New York Times was praising it the other day because they're going to make it shorter, and apparently this was going to reduce the gender gap. Women get too nervous when they have a time condition. This is
Sometimes I wish I were born 5 years or 10 years later than I am, but actually I don't, because
you would got perfect math score.
Yeah, I would not have been. I could have avoided the SAT, but actually I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I missed this crazy woke onslaught in high school, because I think
too.
God, it must be so hard being young and going through puberty and figuring it all out, and then having all this sludge.
And them telling you,
yes,
you might not be a boy,
you might not be your
a
gender,
girl. Yeah.
and it's just sick beyond belief. Okay, so let's get back here to civil rights law, because I think this is really important. The disparate impact case, super important for people to know about. also you were talking about the 64 Civil Rights Act. My understanding is that one of the bad things about the Civil Rights Act is that it allowed the government to infiltrate into private businesses in the name of, in 64, desegregating those private businesses. But giving the government the ability to desegregate private businesses has subsequently gave the government the authority to do a lot more than just that. And then tracing to today, we see vaccine mandates in private businesses. Is that a fair characterization of part of the problem of the Civil Rights Act?
Yeah, I mean, it was controversial before this that where in the Constitution does it say the federal government has a right to tell private businesses not to discriminate? Well, they got it from the Commerce Clause,
yes.
Supposedly, because they engage in interstate commerce, therefore, but that's not what the Commerce Clause was. I mean, right. James Madison, these guys are rolling over in their graves hearing that. And so you're right. I mean, the Civil Rights Act, like the ban on discrimination, is probably not going anywhere. And it's actually, like, I think the stuff that came later, like the innovations on top of that. But look, if nobody likes discrimination, or most people don't like discrimination, but how do you stop it without mind reading, right? Even intentional, just forget disparate impact. How do you stop? You say, you didn't hire this person because they're a woman. You say, no, I didn't. It was because of X, Y, Z. Goldwater warned about this in a speech on why he was voting against the Civil Rights Act. He said this would require basically an informer mentality. It's a great quote. I mean, businessman spying on businessman, neighbor against neighbor to gain advantage. I mean, this is he was prophetic. That's exactly what happened. So I agree with you. I don't actually recommend repealing the Civil Rights Act because I just think it's impossible. I'm a political realist,
right.
So I tell people what they can do, sort of short of that, to change things.
And Barry Goldwater was smeared, as a racist for opposing the passage of the Civil Rights Act, but he was the founder of the Arizona chapter of the NAACP and desegregated his own family business. So just for the record, everyone, wanted to throw that in there. And by the way, you know what I think, and I'm curious to hear your reaction, you know what I think was the ultimate full circle moment with the Civil Rights Act was affirmative action, because the Supreme Court recently used the Civil Rights Act in arguing that Harvard and other private institutions could not practice affirmative action. Why? Because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 allowed the government to say to private institutions, you have to be race blind. In other words, you can't desegregate.
Yeah.
And then 60 whatever years later, it's the same thing. The government is using that same act to tell a private business, Harvard, you have to be race blind, but now it's with something that many people want, which is affirmative action. That's right. I mean, this was Title VI of the Civil Rights Act because you get federal funding. The government can tell you not to discriminate. And I mean, it's amazing because the universities, people think of these universities as sort of the source of wokeness, but quote, racial and gender quotas actually started being forced on them by the federal government. So it was the 1970s, they go to Columbia, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which existed at the time. And they say, give us your data on how many women and how many minorities you're hiring. The president of Columbia writes an open letter. He says, we don't even collect that data. We're a university. We're not in the race bean counting business. Wow. The president of Columbia said that at one point?
He wrote an open letter. Yes. He was like sort of saying this is crazy. We don't even collect the data. We're so decentralized. We don't have any bureaucracy. We don't believe in bureaucracy. We believe in the academic departments running themselves. But then near the end of the letter, he says, well, we're dependent on federal grants, and this is what the federal government is forcing us to do. And this is the kind of institution we'll become. 50 years ago, right? That was Columbia University. Now think about them. Now, if you got rid of all, I know they're not going to go back to being colorblind. I know they're crazy today and they have this bureaucracy, but it just shows you like how law can just transform institutions and then make them into something where we think it's always been like this when it hasn't.
So why did what was it, Department of Health, you said?
Health, Education, and Welfare. It was later broken up into the Department of Health and then Education,
Why did they go to Columbia University in the 70s and demand info on the amount of people of certain races, genders that were among the student body?
I think it's like sort of like the civil rights movement was like this train, and it was just like this, it had this moral sort of sense of, it had this just sort of this moral, halo around it, right? And it just, it won over the country. The original Civil Rights Act was, supported by a vast majority of Americans. And these civil rights activists, it's like almost every, every kind of sort of activist issue. They couldn't just, claim claim victory and then leave. A lot of these people they had made sort of fighting for, and a lot of them before, wanted like quotas, and they were influenced by Marxism and all this other stuff. But they had to sell, to win over this people for the Civil Rights Act. They had to play, this a game that we're Americans and we're colorblind and this and that. And so when the Civil Rights Act passes, those people are still there. Those people go, they staff the parts of the federal government that is tasked with enforcing non-discrimination. They start to interpret it as, okay, that means quotas, that means disparate impact, and sort of nobody's paying attention, right? There's no conservative media at the time. The Warren and the Burger courts are absolutely crazy. They're school busing. You probably know the history of this. They're shipping kids, 45 minutes each way just because desegregation is not enough. We have to take you from your neighborhood and we have to make sure there's racial balance. So they're just doing these crazy things. I think it was just sort of the moral righteousness of the civil rights movement that won. It just sort of kept going.
So you have a chapter here, Government as the Creator of New Races and Genders, and that's sort of what I was hinting at with my question about strict scrutiny.
Yeah.
Or saying that I was going to ask you a question about strict scrutiny. So first, can you tell us, summarize for me, give me a reminder of my con law class. What is strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, the standards that the U.S. government or the Supreme Court uses to evaluate certain cases based on the person involved? And what do you mean when you say that the government has created new race and genders?
So the strict scrutiny standard basically is, if you want to simplify it, it's the idea that if you have a law where you or your policy where you discriminate based on race, you really have to show there's, a compelling interest and it's narrowly tailored. It can't be just all encompassing. Now, what that means in practice, it depends on the judge, right? Is affirmative action, does it pass strict scrutiny? Because that's discrimination against whites and Asians. The liberal justices always say, yes, it passes it. I think the conservative justices have a much better argument, and they say no, as they did in the SFFA and the Harvard case. But taking a step back, why do we hear so much about Hispanics and whites and blacks and Asians? Where do these categories come from? Whites, blacks, okay. We sort of know where that is in American history. Native American, okay. The creation of Hispanic, this concept didn't really exist in the 1960s, 1970s. I Love Lucy was the biggest show in the 1950s before my time, obviously, too. But it was the biggest show in the 1950s. Nobody talked about it as a great breakthrough for Hispanics, right? The husband is Cuban. Ricky. Yes. And so nobody even thought of in these terms. There were Mexicans, there were Cuban Americans, and then in the 1960s and 70s, the government starts classifying these people Hispanic. They just start throwing them together. And what you see is I have a sort of analysis from Google Ngrams, which is Google Books, and you see Hispanic and Latino just starts taking off after the government creates the term. And then 1980 is the first census where they have a Hispanic category. The New York Times in 1978 runs a front page story where demographers are like, this is ridiculous. This is just political activism. These Puerto Rican congressmen and these Mexican congressmen, they want to have enough, they want to come together just so they can have enough to sort of get their constituents some kind of help. The demographers in the New York Times say this makes no sense. It's a completely political category. It doesn't matter. In 1980 we have Hispanics created on the U.S. Census.
Why is
it
a political category? Why should we care if there are Hispanics listed on our census, for instance?
I think we shouldn't. Why should we care, people who want race-blind governance? Because it's the way they collect the data. It determines how you're practicing affirmative action. So there was in the 1970s, there were Polish and Italian groups who would go, hey, look, Poles are underrepresented in corporate CEOs. Can we have affirmative action? Can we have small business contracts? Mm-hmm. And they go, no, we don't collect the data, so we don't have any data on this. And the activists go, you don't have the data because you don't collect the data. So as soon as the groups that they collect the data for become the oppressed categories, right? And everything starts to revolve around that, right? How universities admit people, how the federal government gives grants. If you're a Hispanic organization, you can get a grant. There's something called Hispanic Serving Institution. If you have a high enough Hispanic population in your university, they will give you extra money, even if they don't speak Spanish or whatever. You see San Diego, I think, has just been admitting a lot more Hispanics lately because they want federal funding.
It fuels the war on merit. You're saying we're judging people not based on their merit, but based on their their immutable characteristics.
We don't think about the fact that we don't think about Italian Americans versus Swedish, who has higher test scores, who goes to jail more often. No one cares, right? Because we didn't collect those categories. Asian too, AAPI. Pacific Islander. There's a whole funny story that I won't get into, but it's in the book about how those categories ended up together, but it makes no sense. And then it sort of becomes the reality.
Sense. It's just basically drawing a huge circle around
here's
geographic
what it was.
region.
They were all from Hawaii. So the delegation from Hawaii is where most of the Asians lived in America at the time. And they also had Pacific Islanders. And then basically the delegation of Hawaii said, oh, can we make you, what about you Native Hawaiians? Why don't you become Native Americans? And the government goes, no, then you'd be sovereign. And then we'd have to give you casinos. We don't want to do that. Do you want to just be with Asians? Okay. They come back later and they say, oh, wait, we're Asians now. We're not getting into college as much because Asians score too much. They say, okay, you Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, they actually broke those categories out. So now when you apply to college, they're two different things, because otherwise the Native Hawaiians would get penalized by affirmative action, right? So it's a crazy thing. And like, people believe in this stuff. Like, people believe in AAPI identity. I see it on like Hulu and Netflix.
Oh yeah.
It's all over the place. And it's just, it's crazy. There's an entire history there.
The thing I also find to be kind of interesting and funny is that, we hear colleges and universities and corporations touting how much they care about diversity, but then they encourage their students or their employees to segregate themselves into these like AAPI or Black or Hispanic affinity groups with people who are just totally like them. So how is that diversity? Literally just flocking to the people with whom you share a background. And by the way, even to your point, like with AAPI, in some cases, you don't even share the shared culture or the background.
Right. And yeah,
it's just manufactured nonsense.
It is. And you're telling people at the same time, like, okay, it's not only a manufactured fake category. It's also, this is the important, like,
right. These are the people that you should hang out with.
Yeah. It's not like, the way I see the world, or like my sense of humor, or like, my value system. It's just so ugly and crude. Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't be opposed to obviously I would never, pass a law outlawing affinity groups, or, I would just let people do what they want. But I want people listening to understand why I don't like a lot of the existence of a lot of these groups. It's not actually their existence in the first place. It's how big they've become and how mainstream they've become. Whereas if this were just something kind of on a small level, it's sort of like the transgender issue. 10 years ago, I went to school with a few people who were trans, and I was very empathetic, and I called them by their pronouns, and I'm as nice to them as I am to any other human being. I treat human beings equally. But the second that this started getting so big, and certainly when it started coming for kids, that's when my opposition, at least, grew.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting about that. The affinity groups, actually, if you go to the EEOC website, they tell employers to do this. Like, oh, here's how to discriminate. Here's how not to be discriminatory, so how we're not going to come after you. Make sure to clamp down on jokes. The federal government has a website that tells you, if the joke is sort of risky, keep it out of the workforce just to be safe. They have a best practices thing. You might want to divide your employees into affinity groups and like go recruit like on that basis. It really is just very, very heavy-handed, and the stuff that just sort of seems out there, often there's like these sort of, to borrow a metaphor, the invisible hand of government behind it.
Before we continue with Richard, I want to tell you about My Pillow. Richard, do you sleep on a pillow?
I've been known to, yes.
Do you sleep on sheets?
Yes.
Hopefully, some men don't. No. Speaking of college, men are such heathens. I knew men who didn't have sheets.
Yeah, no, I've got sheets. Although sometimes it's hot, maybe not, but yeah, most times I do.
Well, if you would like to get a pillow and sheets and towels and my slippers, which are right over there, I walk in wearing my slippers every day, you can with the promo code Hartman. That is my last name, everyone, spelled Hartman. For a limited time, all of you can get discounts on these great products. For a limited time, you'll get 60% off specifically of the Giza Dream bed sheets. Give those to a college freshman who is a male, just so you make sure that they have them. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99 with the promo code Hartman. And also, for a limited time, you'll get Mike Lindell's soft cover book free with any purchase that you make. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square, or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. We'll do a second interview where you will tell me if you were convinced by the Nietzsche episode.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you have enjoyed your discounted purchases of My Pillow
10-year
products.
warranty. That is
I know,
is one sturdy
I know.
pillow.
Hey, and I say this usually. I think I forgot to say it, but I use all these products, and they are really, really good. I wouldn't advertise them if I didn't use them and didn't love them. So check that out. So we've talked about the 64 Civil Rights Act, the disparate impact court case, the government classification of these, at times, certainly with AAPI, manufactured categories and affinity groups. Can you give maybe like 2 or 3 more examples or developments that you think is really important or are really important for us to know in the rise of wokeism?
Yeah, there's a handful I point to in the book. So one of them is affirmative action. People think about it in terms of college admissions. It originally came from the idea that government forced it on all government contractors, right? So there's an executive order in 1964 that Johnson signed, said if you have a contract with the federal government, you and all your subcontractors have to divide your employees based on race, and then have to make sure that there are no disparities. You have enough blacks and women and so forth. And so that's like a third of the work of the private sector workforce just has a mandate for affirmative action. A lot of people don't know this, but this is huge. I told Vivek Ramaswamy about this, and he promised to repeal it on his first day in office. So this message is reaching somebody, and
very impressive.
And I'm sure if Trump or DeSantis hears about it, they probably have at this point. It'll probably get repealed too. A Republican president could have done this at any time in the last 50, 60 years. Reagan tried to. The whole story of like how he tried to and how he was stopped is in the book. But yeah, there's affirmative action in government contracting. There's also harassment law. So under the Civil Rights Act, like at the beginning, there wasn't this idea you have to create a comfortable environment for blacks, comfortable environment for women. It was just like discriminatory. Like if you guys make raunchy jokes or whatever and a woman doesn't like it, like that's not discrimination originally under the Civil Rights Act. It really becomes the case in the 1980s and later in the 1990s, where it becomes the case that like, jokes, this sort of becomes in the 1990s. You have sort of it bursts into the public conscious political correctness, like the first sort of wave of political correctness. It's driven by HR people, which is a response I show in the book very directly to civil rights law. There was an evil law called the Civil Rights Act of 1991, signed by George H.W. Bush, which created punitive damages under civil rights law. The number of sexual harassment cases just goes through the roof. I show this in the book right around that time, and so it's very causative. So yeah, you have harassment law, you have affirmative action, then you have Title IX. This is probably more familiar to people because it's more recent. It's really been the last 10, 15 years where they had these tribunals, of men accused of sexual assault, but also, women's sports. It's funny, people think about the trans issue in women's sports, but women's sports, it was a issue of civil rights law long before that, in that it was crazy. They said you have to have parity in between the number of male and female athletes. Well, women don't like sports as much as men. What are you going to do? It doesn't matter. Like you have all these fake women's sports and you have to cancel all these men's sports. So Title IX is
What do you mean by fake women's sports?
Well, they have some sports like rowing, for example, right? The reason we have so many rowing teams in this country, and this was the USC scandal, is because it just takes up a lot of, so they have football, right? They have so many football players. Women don't want to play football. So they have this thing growing just because you could have so many athletes. And these women athletes, a lot of them don't even show up. A lot of them, when I was at UCLA, I talked to a girl on the rowing team. She said they would say recruit friends, and they didn't have people to fill it up. The whole existence of women's rowing is just to get numbers to match football, right? And they're doing all kinds of crazy things, like women's basketball teams will have like practice players who are often men who just practice with the team. They'll be counted as women's athletes just so they could submit it to the government and say we have we have female. They're not trans.
So there are some teams, obviously not at all colleges and universities, but there are some teams that you're saying that are kind of fudging the numbers to have parity with male teams.
Yeah, and it's and they're doing this at the high school level too. There's a federal court case where they're telling a high school in Indiana, if you schedule the boys' game on weekends, you have to schedule the girls' game on weekends, right? And people are like, the community's not that interested in girls' sports, and the court says to the school, it's your responsibility to overcome these stereotypes and make women's basketball just as exciting as men's basketball. Not in exact those words, but basically that's the idea of the court decision. So the level of social engineering here is just absolutely crazy.
Your final chapter is called What is to Be Done. And you said at the beginning of this interview, which I appreciated, that you not only talk about where this comes from, but how we can rectify the situation. Boy, though, it seems like sort of an insurmountable obstacle with all of the new initiatives and laws and mainstream ideas that have come into the fore. That's not, I don't mean that in a discouraging way. We have to combat it. But what are some of your proposals to try to get rid of some of this?
Yeah.
When it is so huge.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. It is a hard problem. I mean, we didn't get here overnight. I'm talking about things that happened in 60s and 70s, and you're looking at the cultural repercussions to today. So you change the law, we're still going to have, a similar culture, but you're hoping for decades down the line, institutions develop in a different way. So some things will change immediately, some things you'll have to wait. But what you can do, there's a lot. So I talked about there's just highest level president, executive order, can do things like repeal affirmative action executive orders for contractors and within the federal government. Again, Vivek promised that. You can revisit the disparate impact case, the Griggs case from 1971. That's a big one. This Supreme Court now, it's like sort of everyone has a role to play, because I'm sure they would not rule that way on Griggs today if that came before them. Mm-hmm. But you need the right person to challenge it. Challenge this stuff. You need conservative legal professors and lawyers and organizations to make the argument and get it in front of the Supreme Court, right? Get it in front of some of these conservative judges. So there's a role for different people to play. Title IX, the Trump administration did great things. They pushed back a little bit on the Obama administration, what they had done previously. There's a lot more you can do. And then there's, harassment law. There's bringing sort of the First Amendment in there, and saying that a lot of this stuff really runs afoul of the Constitution when you're telling, employers what kind of environment and what they can and can't say at work. And so, I've been, it's been so, it's been heartwarming. I mean, people they want to do something. They don't want to just sit and watch TV and see this latest woke craziness and get mad and just boycott Bud Light. That's fine, mm-hmm. But that's not gonna bring the country back where it needs to be. So there's stuff you could do at the state level. There's executive branch you could do. There's especially the judiciary, probably the most important thing. I mean, it's all in there in the book for anybody, no matter where you are in sort of the conservative movement or what your position is. I guarantee you, there's probably something you could do.
This seems so comprehensive and fabulous, and obviously hugely important. And again, I appreciate that you're presenting solutions. One of the things that I say is, just as corny as it sounds, speaking up in everyday conversation is so important, because this is how these ideas get tossed around and become mainstream. Like, for instance, we see what's going on with Russell Brand. Russell Brand is being accused of sexual misconduct. Maybe he did it, maybe he didn't. Obviously, we need to wait and see. But the British Parliament is sending this letter calling for him to be monetized before it's even been proven, if it is indeed true, that he has done these terrible things. And I said on my show recently, I said, this is the outgrowth of the Believe All Women mantra. Believe All Women is a slogan, is an idea. It starts in a classroom, in a restaurant, in a conversation with people, and then it grows and grows and grows and spreads like a virus, and then turns out to affect someone's real life in this case. So I would just add on to that by saying that, when you hear something like Believe All Women, cut in and stick up for that.
There's a role to play for courage. I mean, a lot of these institutional battles are sort of within institutions, right? So you have these leftists, and they're sort of, I have a friend who compared civil rights law to a force multiplier. It sort of tilts the playing field in their advantage. But no matter where you are, there is a place to speak up and just point out how crazy this stuff is.
Mm-hmm. Richard Hanania, thank you so much for coming on. Did I say it right? Hanania?
I mean, you said it beautifully. I
really?
don't know about right, but I like the sound of it.
We may or may not have practiced that 50,000 times before the interview. I so appreciate your being here. And thank you all so much for being here. As a reminder, Richard's book is called The Origins of Woke. What an important read for all of us. Take care. I'll see you soon.